Hi, Facebook and Instagram. Today we're going to talk about how to write realistic dialogue. I am going to set up Instagram. I'm on Facebook and YouTube here. I'll set up Instagram in just a second, and then we'll get started. Hi, Instagram. We are here live on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and we are talking today about how to write realistic dialogue. It's a really fun subject, and I love talking about the writing craft. So we're going to be doing a lot more of these craft type lessons in the next few weeks. So hope you're excited. Let's get started. So the first thing you need to know about writing dialogue is, as you learned from the title, it needs to be realistic. So if you have dialogue that sounds, what's the word, stinted, or it just isn't quite making sense, it just doesn't sound natural, your readers are not going to believe that you know what you're doing, and they're not going to engage with your story. So they'll ultimately probably stop reading. So you want to make sure your dialogue makes sense, that it's realistic, that it's something that they could possibly hear in everyday life, depending on the situation, of course. So we're going to talk about why it matters a little bit more into that. And then we're going to go over some tips for writing dialogue, and specifically some tips for making it realistic so that it's something actionable for you guys to take away with you. All right, so why it matters. It keeps the reader from being bored. Like we talked about, the reader might get bored and possibly worse, they might get annoyed if your dialogue does not sound realistic. So it's very important to put a focus on this. It also grounds them in the story. So it's a good way, and I think I'll talk about this. Yeah, this is another one. Introduces characters organically. So it's a good way to introduce your characters in your story, which in my opinion, characters should drive the story. So your dialogue is a way to introduce them organically to help you, and we'll talk about a little bit how to bring that in. But dialogue is just so important for your readers to really get into the story and really connect with it. All right, and dialogue also moves the story forward. So this has to do with pacing, and there's different ways to do this. I'm not going to quite probably get into those details today, but dialogue can really help with pacing. It can help move the story along. There's ways to make it feel quicker and move like the story's moving more quickly. There's ways to make the story feel like it's slowing down. Dialogue is a good way to help things move a little bit quickly. Hi, Alexis on YouTube. It's so nice that you're here. Thank you for joining in. And always, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask those questions. I'm happy to answer anything about, we're talking about dialogue. We'll talk anything about dialogue, but specifically, I'm going over realistic dialogue and how to make it realistic. If you have any dialogue questions, there's so much more than I could fit into this presentation today. And we'll be talking about that in the future. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, so basically why it matters, I kind of went over that. You guys probably got that by now. You really need it really done well in your book for it to make a lot of sense and to keep your readers engaged in the story. All right, tips for writing dialogue. First one is, you guessed it, make it sound realistic. Okay, well, this is what we're talking about today. So we'll move on to the next one. This isn't specifically the dialogue itself, but this kind of goes into show versus tell, which, as you have heard me, if you've heard me talk at all, you know this is my favorite thing to talk about, show versus tell, but using dialogue tags effectively. So I am a big fan of using minimal dialogue tags. So not very many. And when I say dialogue tags, I mean just like a reference point for the dialogue. So you would say the dialogue and then do a he said, or she said, or he asked, or she inquired, or whatever the word you want to use. I'm not a big fan of those because a lot of times they're unnecessary. Those are unnecessary words that you really don't need. And they can get very repetitive, especially if you use only said or asked. And I know some authors out there say just to use said and asked and be fine with it. That's okay if you only have very few dialogue tags. But I have read books where someone used said and asked all the time, and it got so aggravating. I could not stand that book, and I won't read that author again. So I'm not going to mention who it is, but Just keep in mind your readers are paying attention to how you do this. All right, so what I propose instead of using dialogue tags are what are called action beats, action phrases. Basically, you're indicating who is speaking by the action that's taking place. So you could address that someone is going to speak, they're about to speak, or after they speak, you could say, this person shifted their weight, and then the dialogue. So the reader keys into that person shifting their weight. They're the one the attention's on. They're the one speaking the dialogue. So it's a much better way to also show the reader what's happening instead of telling them, and avoid using those what can become annoying dialogue tags. It helps move the story forward. It helps the show versus tell. It's just all around a good idea. Now, that being said, writing rules are not the same for everyone. So these are what I have found works for me and what has worked for some of my editing clients and what I have found in books I enjoy. If you have a very compelling reason to use dialogue tags primarily in your book, that's why it's creative. That's why it's subjective. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to follow every rule to the T, but this is a good idea so that you can show the reader what's happening instead of telling them, because show versus tell, there is a place for telling, but generally you want to be showing. And that's really one of those rules that you pretty much want to stick to. So that's just kind of a bonus thing. All right. And then you want to differentiate your characters using their voices. So how do we do this? We're going to talk about that. I have a list over here. I want to make sure I cover everything. Yeah, so we'll talk about characters in just a minute, but there is a good way to write realistic dialogue that brings in the characters, that you can show their personalities by the dialogue they say, how they act, all of that. Dialogue is a compelling way so that to kind of break up the prose in a book as well. So you're not just telling the story, which showing versus telling, there it is again. So you're not just being a narrator and telling people what are happening. Dialogue helps the reader really engage in the story. And if you think about it, I always talk about show versus tell. It always comes back to that. So if you talk about show versus tell, and this is a concept I use in teaching that concept as well. But if you think about a movie, someone watching a movie on the screen, you aren't always going to, sometimes you do, but very rarely, get a narrator telling you what's happening. Most of the time, the only thing you're hearing is dialogue, pretty much exclusively. And if you think about it, now maybe you haven't thought about it that way or something, but if you are watching a show and pretty much all you see is dialogue, sometimes there are certain, and sometimes they'll do this with, like, I've seen this with movie adaptations of books, where there's a really strong narrative voice in the book. And so they'll do like a voiceover. You know, you saw that in like Twilight. Bridgerton did kind of something like that. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. But as a general rule, if you're watching a movie or a TV show, you're really not going to hear a narrator. You're only going to hear dialogue. Now in books, we have an opportunity that we're not confined or constricted just to dialogue. We do have the opportunity to write narration and really build out a character's inner world, especially, but build out the world itself, that we can use those descriptors, where on a movie or a TV show, they're doing that visually and we are doing it with our words and creating a word picture. So we have that balance, but it's really a good idea, and it helps bring in the characters, helps create such a compelling picture for them. And because we are in a visual world, and pretty much everyone out there that will be reading your book has seen a movie or a TV show, they're going to process story in a similar way. And so if you explain how the world works and all of that with your prose, but then you use the dialogue to really connect your reader to your characters and connect them to the story and move the story along, you're really going to connect with them and engage the reader in the story. Okay, so some tips specifically on how to make it realistic. Okay, how do we make dialogue realistic? One of the very practical ways that I have found, and I've heard this advice from others as well, is to read it aloud. Now, there is one of the things about dialogue. You may have identified this in yourself as a weakness. Maybe this is something that you just don't do very strongly. You're really good at writing prose, and you need to make sure that your dialogue is on point. Okay, then this might be a really good tactic for you. If you're not sure, and really anyone, if this is even a strength of yours, if something doesn't quite sit right with you as you're reading through it through the editing process or something, and you're going through and you're thinking about, does this actually make sense? Is this something that someone would actually say? Read it out loud. Or sometimes I'll like imagine that I'm hearing it in my head instead of actually saying it out loud, but I'm still kind of like just picking out the actual words and quotes, and we're not going to talk about punctuation today. But that is a big part of dialogue and how that works effectively on the page, especially. But just think about like what it sounds like reading it aloud. Think about all of the nuances in the words and the phrases, how that specific character would talk. And we're going to get into characters. I guess we'll get there in a second. But really just think about the nuances of speech. Think about where that character's from or the setting of your novel. If it's fantasy, you can take a little bit more liberties. If it's a contemporary romance, you probably have to be keyed into where those people live or where your characters are, just kind of the general world, how that world would sound to the reader's ear, because that's what makes it realistic. It's grounded in your world. It doesn't have to be grounded in the real world, whatever that means. It doesn't have to be something that you would hear on the corner street down the road from your house, but it does have to be grounded in your story's world. So that's a kind of a key thing there. All right, so another tip for writing realistic dialogue is it does need to be realistic, and you do need to imagine a normal conversation, but you do not need to write down every word. And I've seen this sometimes, and it's an art form. I fully acknowledge that. So it will take some skills and some learning and trying to see what works. Reading in your genre and outside your genre as well will really help with this. Reading other fiction books will help you kind of get a feel of what to include and what not to include. But every conversation that you have when you're writing dialogue does not have to have a hello or a goodbye or anything. You can stop in the middle of a conversation if that's what serves the story best. Don't want to leave the readers hanging in a way that makes them scratch their heads and they're like, what's happening? Wait, what? Where's the end of the conversation? But there can be compelling reasons for stopping the conversation before it ends. And it could be as simple as just, the rest of this is pretty pedestrian. I don't need to include this in my book and waste page space with this. Let's move on with the story. So really think about and be intentional about what parts of conversations you're including. You need to make them make sense. And sometimes it depends on your writing style. Sometimes I prefer, let's start there. I prefer snippets of dialogue. So I don't really like when people gloss over like, and this person said this and then continue with the dialogue. So you have dialogue with the quotes, actual dialogue, and you're having a conversation, and then in the middle of it, it's like, and this person just said that they were good, and then you continue having dialogue. It can kind of, there could be a place for it, but generally it will kind of bring you out of that dialogue. So you generally want snippets. So you don't necessarily have to the beginning. You don't have to have the very end. You don't even have to have a lot of it, but you just need the important parts. So keep that in mind when you're writing realistic dialogue. Another thing to make it realistic to the reader, which again doesn't have to be anchored in our world, it needs to be anchored in your book's world. It needs to be true to the character speaking. So you wouldn't have a 7th grader speaking in, as if they had a college degree or a master's degree or something, unless that's their thing, unless they're like super smart and you're trying to come across that point. So the idea is it needs to be true to the character. If someone is not very highly educated, they're not going to speak like that. If they are very highly educated, they're also going to speak like that. If they have a profession that has a very specific, is the word lexicon? I'm not sure. Very specific set of terms and words that they use, they might be using those words. Now that might be a little tricky for you to relay to the reader, but there is a way to do it, obviously. But you know that they're going to be speaking in those terms. They usually, a lot of times, like I'm thinking like a doctor. So if a doctor comes in, you are going to have them using the terms that would make sense to them in their profession. But when they're speaking to someone else, that is not in that profession, they're going to be using layman's terms, and that helps connect the reader to it. So that's kind of a side thing, maybe. Not really, but just an example of how you would kind of bring that in. So it just definitely has to be true to the character. So one of the things you can do to help because obviously I'm talking about characters a lot because it has to do with their specific dialogue. So one thing you can do for your characters is to create a speech profile, especially if you're struggling with trying to find their specific voice. And voice doesn't necessarily mean what they say, but it does include that. So develop a speech profile for your characters. What unique phrases do they use? I actually, in I had a beta reader, read one of my books and suggested that certain couples, because I have several couples, but they said certain couples should use maybe one pet name and another couple uses a different pet name. And I hadn't done it that way. I hadn't thought about it that way. But once I did, I said, this makes so much more sense. And so it's kind of incongruous for one couple to use the other couple's, that kind of thing, just to kind of give them a little bit of separation. Now, you don't have to do it that way, but that's just an example. Yeah, just unique phrases that they might use. There could be maybe a group of best friends. They have their own, I don't want to say secret code unless you're like writing like middle grade, YA, new adult maybe. But if there's like a group of friends that maybe have some inside jokes and then they have certain things that they say or certain ways they say things, you can also use these unique phrases to connect characters to each other, because the closer they are, they're probably going to adopt certain, I don't want to say euphemisms, but certain ways they say things, certain figures of speech, things like that, that you wouldn't necessarily normally get if you didn't hang out with that person. So that can show familiarity between characters as well. So other things to consider, we already talked about some of these, but their education level, how much education they've had, where it came from, their profession, like we talked about with someone in the medical field. There are a lot of different professions. There's all kinds that might have specific terminology. Can't think of the word right now. Yeah, like, business jargon, something like that. So there might be certain ones, and it might be one you're well versed in, but you still have to find a way to connect to the reader so that they're not lost in all that business jargon. If they have an accent, that can be a little tricky, but a way to do this, especially if they are not a native English speaker, is to bring in words from their home language, from their primary language, I guess is the way to say it. So like if they have a French accent, you could have them throw in French words. I am not a linguist by any means, so I couldn't tell you what words there would be, but you can bring in stuff like that to kind of show that they have like a French accent without actually having an accent on the page, because that can be tricky to write. Although there can be a few ways in the way that their inflections on certain words, you could write those in a specific way for that character if you chose to do so. I know certain books have written their own language. If you want to take that on, good. Good on you, because I'm not doing that. But anyway, also consider their upbringing. What kinds of words would their family unit they came from? What kinds of words would they say? What kind of background do they have? You want to think about where they grew up, because regionally there are certain things. For example, I am from Michigan, and in Michigan, they call carbonated beverages pop. But I lived in Nashville for a while, and they called it Coke, no matter what kind of beverage it was. I don't really have a word for it now. I live in the Pacific Northwest now, but I don't really drink that, so it's kind of irrelevant for me. But I know there's other places that call it soda. So consider that. That helps to ground the reader in the story as well, because it feels realistic to them, especially if you're writing in our world. That's just a consideration as well. If you're writing fantasy or something where you've created the world, that could be different, but there still could be regional things that help show the reader where that person came from. You would have to establish that, of course. It wouldn't be something the reader would intuitively know, but still helpful to consider. and just idiosyncrasies. Sometimes there could be words that they misspell or missay, I guess. They wouldn't misspell them if they're speaking, but they could say them incorrectly. And that could be something you intentionally misspell just to kind of have a little idiosyncrasy for that character. Maybe, there's so many possibilities here. So I'm giving you some ideas, and hopefully with your character, you're kind of familiar with what kind of wording they would use, what kind of just how they would talk. So I hope that was really helpful about characters. So last thing I wanted to talk about, if you want to go deeper with learning about dialogue and even learning things about show versus tell and pacing and point of view and all kinds of writing craft tips, I am holding a 12-week writing intensive. It's called the Confident Writer Intensive. And it starts the week of April 5th. We are going to go through 12 weeks of basically a weekly writing retreat where you just get the opportunity to learn about the writing craft, learn about what blocks are holding you back from finishing your book, and actually make progress on your book, like actually in the class. So it's going to be so much fun. I'm super excited about it. If you are interested in that, I have a few openings and I would love to chat with you about your book. So just send me a DM if you're on Instagram. Reach out to me on Facebook or YouTube, send a comment, and we can get in touch that way. But I would really love to have you in that, because really the whole goal is to help you make progress in your book. It's just, I know how frustrating it can feel to not be able to make that progress and not be able to write the book that you know is inside you to write, but you just don't know where the problems are and what's holding you back. So that's why I designed the intensive. I'd love to have you inside, and you'll learn so much more about dialogue. That's one of the sessions. We're going to be talking about dialogue. We got another session, like I said, show versus tell, pacing, point of view, characters, world building. We've got all kinds of stuff we're going to talk about, and it's going to be really, really fun. So I'd love to have you. All right, well, we will wrap this up. I am so thankful that you joined me for talking about realistic dialogue. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I would love to chat with you about books because I love books. Yay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I will talk to you next week, and I hope you have a great Tuesday. Bye, Facebook and YouTube.